which is entitled Geopolitical Considerations in the Western Balkans. And I'm Adam Fagan from King's College London. We've got...
Okay, I'm signing off. Bye, guys. Don't disturb me.
We have 5 papers. And the instruction I've been given is that you will all talk for a maximum 15 minutes. And then somehow I will come up, we'll try to coordinate some questions. I think it's not possible for people who are the audience to ask questions, but I will ask some questions of you can ask each other, and then hopefully that will stimulate some further discussion. So I suggest we take it in the order the papers appear in the program. So Jens, let's start with you, if you'd like to introduce yourself as well. The floor is yours.
Okay, also Florian, good to see you to join us. Adam, thank you for the introduction. My name is Jens Bastian. I live and work in Athens, Greece, as a senior policy advisor for a think tank in Athens, ELIAMEP, the Hellenic Foundation for Foreign and European Policy. And I'm going to be presenting on the China perspective of this session's title. For that, I've prepared a presentation, and let me now just share it. Now, I'd first like to thank the organizers for what is a difficult and challenging conference to organize online over 2 days. It's an impressive job for those who've done this in Greece and also from abroad, making this possible. It's the first time that I witness it stretched over 2 days with links to YouTube and to other forms of online presentation. I'm learning from it equally. It's also my first WebEx, which is slightly different than the Zoom presentation. Now, I'm going to focus on what I would call a non-EU external actor that is expanding its footprint in the Western Balkans, or more broadly even in Southeastern Europe, and that is China. And can you now see the second slide of my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Fine.
Yep.
Let me immediately jump in as regards different points of departure, putting it in context. When we look at China as a non-EU external actor in the region, we first of all have to bear in mind a very different time perspective that China has compared to other external actors, like, for example, the EU, Russia, Turkey, the United States, or to a certain degree also Arab countries who are, in particular from the Gulf states, leaving their mark in the region. China has a time perspective in the area of 20 plus years. What it is doing today and yesterday is not something that is to yield results immediately or in the next 2, 3, 4 years. This is done for the long term, and it is also reflected in projects that link to infrastructure connectivity that China has, for example, in Croatia or in Montenegro, in Serbia, in Greece, has gradually put in place and is expanding. Having said that, I would argue, contrary to some who also look at China and try to put it in a strategic context, I would argue that China does not have a master plan for the region. It looks at individual countries, at opportunities in these countries, and it then also tries to coordinate that with the expectations and demands that political and economic elites in these countries have or articulate vis-à-vis China, in particular with regard to, for example, corporate investment in the energy sector or infrastructure construction in the transport sector, or bank lending policies by Chinese banks in various countries of Southeastern Europe, including the Western Balkans. What China is doing with regard to the word connectivity is to develop starting from China over the Eurasian landmass to develop what it calls the Land-Sea Express Corridor, which is a combination of land-based, in particular, railway connectivity, including also some highway construction, and maritime investments, of which there are numerous, which include Turkey, for example, but most strikingly, as the Chinese have repeatedly emphasized, the most important maritime corridor there is the port of Piraeus near Athens, Greece. Just here, a little remark with regard to current events. You can see that if you try to build connectivity over such a large area, there can be massive and unexpected problems. And what we are currently seeing, for example, in Azerbaijan, directly impacts on the development of such a land-sea express corridor, because it impacts on the railway connectivity that China uses also through Azerbaijan and which is currently interrupted. Next to these large-scale, very visible projects, China is also engaged in what I would call capacity building, in particular in areas of institutional networking. This is highlighted in the picture below with regard to the so-called 17+1 network, where a host of countries from Central Eastern and Southeastern Europe have, over the course of the past 8 years, joined this network, which is by and large a China-led network, which is a bilateral, elite-driven network, reflected also in the summits, where governments seek agreement, try to raise interest in their infrastructure projects, raise financing via Chinese policy banks, and generally attract the attention of Chinese policymakers. The problem, the challenge that you can see over the course of such capacity building efforts is that it creates expectations. Expectations in terms of how does China not only create, for example, in certain areas, expectations of what it can do in infrastructure, in lending, in corporate investment, but also in terms of hard facts on the ground. And the management of these expectations is increasingly proving to be a challenge for Beijing in terms of trying to identify the disconnect that exists in a number of countries between what is promised and what is actually happening on the ground. My next slide follows on the basis of such capacity building that China has established over the course of the past years, and how it is in a position to now also extend that, supplement that, because it has established an institutional network in areas with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic. China's activities in these areas highlighted through different pictures here about, for example, mask delivery in Albania, in Greece, in Belgrade, and in a host of other countries in Europe. They tell us two things which I think are important in this regional and geopolitical context. On the one hand, I think that this politics of generosity, as it is also being labeled, it highlights how China is able to widen the parameter of engagement in the region. It now includes the fact that China is actively involved and intervening in medical supply chains of these countries. This is something unheard of only a year or two ago, and not only because of the pandemic. I think it also tells you something if you look at the pictures in terms of their visibility and the narrative that China is trying to portray here, that it sees itself and it tries to articulate that as a constructive partner during a pandemic. And my concern that I see in the region with regard to geopolitical confrontations is that with regard to donation diplomacy, China is actually in a position to win, to shape the narrative. And it is doing so in particular vis-à-vis the European Union. And this is shaping a narrative despite the fact that different European institutions are on the ground doing much more, but having less visibility of what they are doing, what they are providing, what kind of assistance packages, also massive financial assistance packages that European institutions are providing on the ground in these countries. But the EU is not winning the narrative, the publicity, the visibility aspect of these interventions. That leads me directly already to the reaction of two other major players in this geopolitical confrontation. First, the reaction of the EU vis-à-vis China. Here we can see that with regard to its strategic outlook that the European Commission formulated in March of last year, where very new language, new classification of China became visible and signified a point of departure unprecedented in the manner in which the European Commission would label China. That we have not stayed to only focus on the rhetoric of such new labeling, such new kind of communication. What we are also seeing that such a strategic outlook is gradually taking shape in substance in different policy areas. You can see that with regard to, for example, new investment screening regulations. You can see it in a greater articulation, a strong emphasis of European institutions vis-à-vis countries in Southeastern Europe in the accession negotiation process to remind them, quote, to ensure consistency with EU law, rules, and policies. And you can see it in other policy areas which will affect countries in Southeastern Europe, be it, for example, procurement strategy, or how the European External Action Service is starting to, for example, label disinformation campaigns of China by name, something that a year or two ago would have been unheard of. But many of these activities from the European Union, as important and as necessary as they are, I would argue that they are defensive policies in areas where the EU can intervene and can regulate. But these defensive policies also tell us something about the limits of EU agency vis-à-vis China, because the EU is not, at least not yet, in a position to actually change China's behavior. Hence the label that it is a defensive policy, necessary as it appears. The other external actor that I want to focus on is the US administration. What we can observe over the course of the past 2 years is that the Trump administration has rediscovered the strategic importance of the region. And it is embedded in a more larger confrontation between the US and China in various policy areas, some of which I will address in a moment. The sense of disengagement that many observers and analysts had identified with regard to the United States in the course of the past years actually is starting to be reversed, and you can see a stronger, very strategically, transactionally motivated re-engagement of the US administration in this region. And my hunch is that this will continue irrespective of who will win the presidential elections in the United States. Two examples to underline that. One is that the US administration has, over the course of the past 12 months, successfully brought 8 countries, which are listed here on the slide, to sign legally non-binding agreements with regard to 5G networking and to exclude what is called untrustworthy vendors. And untrustworthy vendors means, without actually naming it, that Huawei is not to be part of the procurement process when these licenses are up for tendering in the course of the next year. And some countries have been most explicit about excluding Huawei, and Serbia and Kosovo have recently signed such a legally non-binding agreement. And even if it is legally non-binding, in my view, any US administration in the coming years will remind the signatory countries in the region of their political commitment. Hence, you have here an area of potential future friction and possibly also of coordination as we move forward.
Jens, I'm very sorry. Time is not on your side. If you could wrap it up, that would be absolutely great. Thank you.
Yes. The other example is with regard to the US intervention in Romania on nuclear energy. I therefore come to my last slide. The geopolitical competition in the Western Balkans, in my view, will continue. This is not a recent phenomenon, as is highlighted by the quote that you see from Federica Mogherini. We are seeing that this region is part of what is called the chessboard of big power games. But I argue that the countries in the region have very limited leverage with regard to what they can do vis-à-vis the United States or Turkey, the EU or Russia. They also have this in this list of countries, of big power countries, they have conflicting loyalties. And this creates part of the friction that we are witnessing in different policy areas. China's impact in the region will continue, and it will also diversify over time. But we can also see that there is pushback, as illustrated by the EU, by the US, and I also would argue that there is pushback within host countries of the region of Southeastern Europe. I can further detail that in the course of the conversation. Thank you for your attention.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. And sorry to have to cut you short there. Florian, the floor is now yours. You need little introduction or no introduction, but you might want to introduce yourself anyway.
Thanks, Adam. And of course, I was already moderating the previous panel, so I will not introduce myself, but rather focus on presenting my paper, and I want to make sure that it's actually visible. So my presentation is basically on a preliminary ideas of a project I'm thinking about. So please bear with me that this is not fully fleshed out. What I'm interested in is basically the way in which Europe has been understood as an idea differently by, especially on the side of nationalists in Europe historically and more recently, including the far right. So basically what I'm trying to argue in the overall project I'm looking at is that what often in the kind of common perception, the European Union is juxtaposed to, or Europe is juxtaposed as something which is different or opposing nation states and challenging nation states. And this has been often the way in which the far right and nationalist groups have been framing Europe. I argue that there is another frame, and that's the one that Europe is in fact appropriated by nationalist and far-right groups, and that this is something which is, of course, nothing new, but it's been coming to the foreground in recent years. And I want to do that in this particular case, looking at the context of the so-called West Balkan Route and the migration through the Western Balkans, and how this shaped the way in which Europe is understood and also Europeanization is understood. So I'm starting out with two vignettes. One is a headline from Politica, which is well-known Serbian daily, always loyal to whoever is in power. And in the beginning of this year, it it published a headline on the front page with the title, Europe is preparing itself for a new Battle of Maritsa. The Battle of Maritsa is the river Evros as well, as it's known in Greek, the border river between Greece and Turkey today, but it's also not in that location, but elsewhere was the site of a decisive battle between Serbia and the Ottoman Empire, or not Serbia, but Serbian and other Southeast European forces, which was actually more important for the defeat of Serbia in the Middle Ages by the Ottomans than the notorious, well-known Battle of Kosovo. So quite clearly, this headline suggests that Europe is under threat by, in that case, migrants who are threatening, just like the Ottomans did 6 centuries ago. So you can see several themes here. One is, and I was struck by it, is the reference to Europe. So it's not referring to Serbia, but it's also, of course, framing migration in the context of the threat coming from the east, which in different times has been, whether it has been the Mongols or the Ottomans. And this stands in stark contrast to images which were prevalent a few years ago. Here's a statement by Serbian Prime Minister at the time in 2015, during the peak of the so-called migration crisis, where he said at a speech at the Council of Europe, I have to say that we have acted from time to time in an even more European way than some European countries, and we will stay on that path. And shortly around that time, he also met some refugees who were camped out in central Belgrade on their way to Western Europe. So the two pictures suggest a certain way two very different perspectives. One is the narrative of Europe is under threat by an aggressive, violent horde, as embodied by the headline of Politica. And here it's quite different. Namely, here, the way Europe is understood is that Aleksandar Vučić said that he or Serbia acted more European. And he was alluding to, of course, that Serbia had not closed the borders in the same way as Hungary had, and had allowed refugees to pass through Serbia on the way to Western Europe. So you can see quite competing pictures of Europe. One where in both cases Serbia tries to present itself as European, but in one very different types of Europe. So what I'm trying to argue here is that Europe is not a singular vision, but has different projections. And so I'm going to first look at the way in which Europe has been appropriated by the far right across Europe. And you could see a few representative pictures here which highlight how the idea of Europe has entered the discourse of the far right. On the top right, we see a picture of the very far right German national, the National Democratic Party of Germany, which had a recent Congress with a Croatian member of parliament represented under the headline Fortress Europe, Festung Europa. We also have a picture of the protests in East Germany under the banner a few years ago under the title of Pegida, which stood for the Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the Occident. And finally, a picture of the meanwhile much diminished Freedom Party, together with other European far right-wing parties, including Jean-Marie Le Pen, including AfD representatives and other far-right parties, under the headline of Patriotic Spring. And what I want to highlight with this is that if we look back at the discourse of far right-wing groups, social movements and parties, maybe 10 years ago, the main theme would have been anti-European, against the European Union, maybe a declaratory mention of the Europe of fatherlands. But we see in the meantime that appropriating Europe has become a central feature of these groups. That they call themselves Europeans when it comes to Pegida, for example. There are deliberate attempts of the far right to work together. And you can see even in the Patriotic Spring, you have an eagle with your European stars in the background. So it's really kind of even visually reappropriating the European Union for the different narrative. This continues in other ways as well. So we have these protests which are framing Europe as a defensive project and often drawing on historical narratives. So on the top left, you see protests organized in recent years by the so-called identitarian movement, which has been organizing it to commemorate the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683, and again framed it with symbols of Vienna and symbols of, again, they even have a picture of Native Americans with the idea that Europeans are threatened like Native Americans would be, but also of Sobieski, who was the Polish commander who helped to lift the Ottoman siege of Vienna. So again, framing this in a European context. Similarly, in Sofia protests 4 years ago with banners of Merkel muss weg against migration. So what I'm trying to say here is that there are these movements which have these themes of Europe in them. And in fact, if we go to Southeastern Europe, we have a replication of them or beginning to see some of that. So while in the last during the peak of the migration crisis, there was very few protests or even open opposition, except for some very far right-wing marginal groups. We've seen a proliferation of that in recent years. So we had a protest in Belgrade in March, right before the lockdown, with banners such as "You will not replace us," which is, of course, a common theme of far right-wing anti-immigrant group, the so-called replacement or grand replacement theory. And also in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in late August, there was a protest against migration with banners such as this one, "I love Bihać," "Stop Migrants," IOM, and other migration organizations, "Go Home." So, of course, these movements, and we have to be careful, these social movements and parties are often marginal, or they're often there to emphasize or overplay their relevance through these protests. But what are the themes? First of all, they take pan-European themes, not just national themes. So the great replacement idea is one which is circulating within the European public space. And of course, beyond that, it's been picked up by far right-wing terrorists from New Zealand to North America. There's also pan-European communication, language usage, for example, "Merkel muss weg" in German in Bulgaria, or "You will not replace it" in English in Serbia, as well as in a certain way trying to reach a European audience. And then also it's the framing. So it's not a framing of course, there's a national framing, national symbols, a priest in the Bulgarian case, Serbian symbols in the Serbian protest, but it's framed also in a European context. So it's the defense against Europe, and of course, evoking historical legacies of the defense against Europe by, especially in Southeastern Europe. So in that sense, it's what I say is one phenomenon is the reappropriation of Europe by the far right. And then there have been two other important elements. It's the appropriation of Europe in a much more elaborate way by Viktor Orban, who has in a certain way taken Europe so we have this kind of very strong, and I'm not going to go into a discourse analysis, but just give an example of using the idea that he's not anti-European, but rather that he's anti-Brussels. And of course, we know the famous poster campaign, as you can see there, which depicts Jean-Claude Juncker together with George Soros. The idea that Orban is representing Europe against globalists, internationalists. So here we have a speech from him, the speech to the nation from February of this year, where he says, "We learned that Europe is not in Brussels, Europe is us, and we do not have to measure up to the tired Brussels elite who will soon be delusioned even with themselves. We used to think that Europe was our future. Today we know that we are the future of Europe." So this is kind of very clearly embodies this idea that in fact he claims to be the representative of Europe, not just of Hungary. So it's reappropriating Europe. So what does that mean then as a result? It means in a certain way reinterpreting what Europe is. And that is something which is not just the domain of the far right, but it's also in a certain way become part of the mainstream. And this is what I call the kind of use of the geopolitical Europe, which is of course also the name given by the European Commission currently in office to itself, which was embodied already earlier in 2016 when it came to the border closures, where North Macedonia under the Gruevski government closed the border for the migrants and received praise and electoral support by back then Foreign Minister Sebastian Kurz, who used that to build his political career on it. But it's also continued, for example, in the way in which the EU president of the Commission, von der Leyen, and Charles Michel, the European president, went to Greece this year. And again, the imagery on the left, a highly militarized perspective on the border, and the statement as well, this border is not only a Greek border, but it's also a European border. And I stand here today as a European at your side. So it's a commitment of solidarity, but it's also one which is very much framed in this defending Europe on its borders. And I think we have to be in a sort of way see how this is discursively changing the meaning of Europe in a way. And what I'm arguing, and I'm coming to my conclusion, is that, of course, this also means that the countries of Southeastern Europe are, what does it mean to Europeanize in this context? And especially then when you get offers like this, again, Viktor Orban at the Bled Strategic Forum just 2 months ago, or less than 2 months ago, where he said enlargement has to go forward, and we must unhesitatingly admit Serbia to complete the security structure, because this is also where migrants are coming through. And he says the Serbs would be happy to join. It is possible to talk with the Serbs, and everybody knows that the Serbs are important. So you can see the kind of framing there. Of course, it conflates nation with state. It does not talk about accession process, or it doesn't talk about criteria. It doesn't talk about conditionality. It talks about security, geopolitically driven enlargement. Now, of course, Viktor Orban is not in a majority in the European Union, but it is part of a larger reinterpreting what the European Union and what Europeanization means. That it's not just about the EU conditionality, EU accession the conventional way, but it's different. So, what are my 3 preliminary conclusions? The first one is that there's maybe a Europeanization of the Western Balkans, that the kind of pan-European themes of anti-immigrant rhetoric is finding greater resonance in the Western Balkans. So there's a kind of discursive integration into Europe on that level, one which we might find rather regretful. And then there's also a reimagining what Europeanization means. Which Europe do you Europeanize to? Do you Europeanize to Viktor Orban's Europe? And I think what we're seeing is that there is an idea of a different Europe than the one which is conventionally thought to be that of Europeanization. And so it's redefining notions of Europeanness. And what I think this is interesting to realize, that this is not about we should move away from discussing Europeanization or European integration as a challenge or something which softens the sharp edges of nationalism, but one which can be appropriated as well, which can mean different things. So when we're talking about European identity construction and Europeanization, we have to be much more careful, maybe in light of all of this, to make sure that we define what kind of Europe we mean and what kind of Europeanization we mean when we use this terminology. So much for me.
Thank you, Florian. That's fascinating stuff, and I'm sure will generate a lot of interest. And thanks very much for keeping to time. Péter, the floor is yours, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself as well.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
We can hear you and see you.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Péter Reményi. I'm from University of Pécs, Hungary, southwestern part of Hungary, countryside town university. And I'm an associate professor at the Institute of Geography. So I'm by profession a geographer and historian. And together with my colleague, who is a political scientist, we prepared a presentation. I tried to share now. Lucky position to talk after Mr. Bieber, who a bit introduced some part of this Hungarian and other Central European issues in connection with the Western Balkans or Western Balkans route. In our presentation, I will focus on a different layer of this geopolitical relations, and it's not security, but it's rather economy. I would like to put into the focus of our presentation. I'm a bit in the same situation as Mr. Bieber. This is an ongoing research. We started it a few months ago, half a year ago, but we are far from ready. What we are trying to do is contextualize and apply a critical geopolitical, geoeconomic approach to the V4 and the Western Balkan relations. We define V4 as part of the internal semi-periphery of the EU. You can see them encircled in red around here. So let's take this as the core of the or center of the European Union, and this light blue as a semi-periphery, an internal semi-periphery already inside the EU, but forming some kind of semi-periphery. And the Western Balkans is part of the larger periphery of the outer or external periphery of the European Union. And our research interest lies in the examining from a critical geographical, critical geopolitical approach, the relationship of the two. And now, as the preliminary phase or first phase, through the relationship of Hungary and Serbia, and that's the place where these two regions intersect or meet geographically. So this is the closest part of the two groups of countries here. Our methodological background is rather from the social theory context, and we try to first in this first phase create a framework, a social theory framework in which we can reanalyze and reframe the whole geopolitical, geoeconomic relationship. We have two maybe bold preliminary statements. First is that without the international capital, or assessing international capital in the region, we cannot understand the ongoing processes, our political processes and economic processes in the region, especially in the V4 region. So international capital is the main force here. The second preliminary statement of ours is that enlargement fatigue is rather an euphemism from our point of view. It's rather covering self-interests of some core EU countries, and it also reflected by the weaker geopolitical or economic interest to the region, and so on and so forth. So these two phenomena opens up, let's say, or the passivity of these core states open up a possibility not only for China or other external actors to interfere in Western Balkan politics or something like that, but for also for the internal periphery. For example, the V4 countries, including Hungary, to enter this so-called fatigue gap and improve its global or regional position here in the Western Balkans. The social theories we used in this research is, well, not a really fresh one. Wallerstein's word system analysis, in which we think it is still useful to assess this kind of center-periphery relations, semi-periphery, periphery relations at the fringes of the EU, and here I'd like to draw your attention to a few statements of ours put in bold, that the semi-periphery, that would be the V4 countries, including Hungary. So the capital to this group of countries, the strategies to move forward in the global supply chains is either the capital accumulation or pressing down price of some peripheral labor, and that's what's going on in Hungary, for example. And besides the classical relations of labor and capital, we have to address also two other class relations, which is the central capital and semi-periphery capital, but there the conflict of interest is that the semi-periphery capital is somehow subordinated to the central capital, and in this, to changing this, the capital of the semi-periphery usually calls the state to help him, and it usually results in national liberation movements, historically as well, but in the case of Hungary, recently as well. And the other one is the conflict of interest of labor in the center and the semi-periphery, which is usually connected to immigration, emigration, and their regulation. This is just to draw your attention on the fact that all these countries are so much connected economically to the center, especially Germany. At least one fourth of their export goes to the German economy. The second social theory model is about the model of financial capitalism in Hungary. That's from a Hungarian author, Sebők Miklós. As far as I know, it is not translated into English, but I translated its title by myself. It's Trapped into Paradigms. That's from 2019. And he states in his theory that there is a fault line somewhere around the 2010s, which divides the two types of economic policy in Hungary. Prior to that, there was a modernization consensus. There was different types of modernization in Hungarian economy, but modernization was a consensual fact. But after 2010, after the Fidesz governments, it is turned to financial nationalism, and instead of modernization, it's rather a financial nationalism, where the most important actors are the so-called national capitalists, the government and the institutions, and the new elite of economists, and that it is a real change. And these two approaches of economic policy in Hungary are in antagonistic relationship to each other, either black or white. The third one is Gabor Schering's the accumulative state model. It is already published in English, The Retreat of Liberal Democracy, and the scholar states that after 2010, Hungary can be considered an accumulative state instead of the competition state. That's something, a continuation of the previous theory or the previous idea. And he states that this is due to the revolt of the national capitalists in Hungary, and the state, the accumulative state, is something like a compromise, an institutionalized compromise between transnational capitalists, national capitalists, and the government and the political leadership. And in this framework, we try to understand what's going on between Hungary and Serbia in the recent years. Of course, we have to mention not really as a theory, but rather as a practical approach to this policy, this economic policy. The president of the Hungarian National Bank, György Matolcsi's ideas, these so-called unorthodox measures, the Hungarian model, or simply the Matolcsism, which creates the framework of the economic policy in recent Hungary. From this, I again highlighted two things. That's the rising regional opportunities of the V4 towards the Western Balkans, which is very important and stressed idea of this Matolcsism, and also the so-called from 2019 this outvestment strategy to promote of Hungarian national companies to invest abroad. That's called in Hungarian. I try to translate it outvestment, and I don't know if it does mean anything in English at all. And through this theoretical framework, we try to analyze the Hungarian-Serbian relations, where we pointed to one. There are more challenges in this regard. One of them is security, as Mr. Bieber addressed it. But the other one is the human capital. The question of human capital, which is a great challenge in the semi-periphery of the EU. Today we already heard about something about population decline in the region. This is a projection of the United Nations that there is a population decline in this region. Reds are the countries already in the EU, so let's say the internal semi-periphery, and green countries are those who are the external periphery of the EU, and these are the 20 fastest depopulating countries of the world, according to UN. So that's a real issue in this region, and this is a serious shortage for the so-called national capital which was coined by the previous theoretical frameworks. So the national capital is trying to force the government to do something in regard of this shortage of labor, shortage of human capital. The Hungarian, I mean, the strategy of the government is multifold. So there is something to do with the transformation of educational system as well as other measures. But now I only focus on measures which can connect it to the relationships with Serbia. And this is the focusing on the ethnic Hungarians beyond the border. So that's a passportization issue which is going on from 2010, the simplified nationalization rules. Also, there is a state from 2016, a state-coordinated labor recruitment in neighborhood countries, in spite of being an anti-immigrant country. So from state monies, state agencies recruit labor force in Ukraine and in Serbia for Hungarian companies. From 2017, citizens of Serbia and Ukraine just do not need work permits to work in Hungary. Employers just have to send the file into the agency that they are working in. So it's like some 50,000, officially 50,000 neighboring citizens from neighboring countries are working in the Hungarian labor market. Well, that's way less than the Ukrainians working in Poland.
Péter, I'm sorry. Could you wrap it up, please? You've got about a minute.
Yeah, sure. Okay, just two slides as far as I can remember. So it's so Hungary's changing policy towards Serbia includes a lot of measures taken by either the government. It's like cross-border infrastructure development, gas interconnector, joint strategies toward third parties like China, and it's all wrapped in like Western Balkan enlargement or Interreg. And you can see the economic development results as well. On the previous page, the growing trade measures. Here, the economic aid, development aid paid to Hungarians outside of Hungary, and from his Vojvodina is the greatest recipient. Also, the Hungarian enterprises are realizing a lot of investments, foreign direct investments. That's from Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We'll be realizing 18 billion, for instance, 50 million euros, with the government help of 24 million euros. There are a lot of Hungarian companies working in this regard. And to sum it up, with that the activity of Hungarian capitalism increases in the Western Balkan, and this is a result of the fatigue gap I mentioned earlier, and the financial nationalism turn in Hungary after 2010. The accumulating state helps this expansion with its institutions, and the state itself is also an active power. And also these invisible soft power techniques like media acquisitions we have heard today in the case of Slovenia helps this. In regard to Serbia, so far this is a friendly competition for resources because we are in the same, I mean, the Hungarian government and Serbian government, the same political platform. But we cannot, and the relationships haven't been better ever. They always.
We should leave it there, I'm afraid. But
yeah,
we've got one more paper, and I don't want to.
Okay. The only thing is, I would like to say is that we cannot forget that for a semi-periphery, this is still an economic opportunity. So that's a symmetric relation which is developing.
Thank you. Very well done. Thank you. Yannis.
Hello. Greetings from Thessaloniki. I suppose last. But from Thessaloniki,
certainly not least. The floor
yeah,
is
but
yours,
Thessaloniki since the declaration of 2003, maybe it's a correlation, yeah, that can make some sense. So we'll try first of all. I am a PhD candidate at the University of the Aegean, and this is part of my dissertation concerning the security defense policy of the European Union and the enlargement in the Western Balkans. I will try to make I will try to share a little presentations I have. I will try to be as coherent and in order to. Can you see my presentation?
We can indeed. Yeah.
Okay. So the question is, does the enhanced cooperation of the European Union member states, Article 43 of the Lisbon Treaty, creates new conditions in the relations of the European Union and the Western Balkans? We have to make some. We have to take some things as facts in order to answer this question, in order not to be, how to say, misguided, to build a framework of thought. The mutual interest between the European Union and the Western Balkans for the enlargement and the accession, the EU geopolitical interest, including autonomy, that can make correlations with what Mr. Bastian has previously presented, and that differentiated integration is a structural process of EU, either positive or negative, we will see. So, we have seen some differentiated integration since the Maastricht Treaty. The most prominent examples are the Monetary Union and the Schengen. There have been many researchers and many academics who worked on that, and we have concluded mostly that we have horizontal, the level of European rules the state applies to itself, and vertical, the area where the norms, European norms, apply. Also, we have internal differentiation inside the EU and external differentiation outside. Until now, we have an example of Norway, where it applies 75% of European rules without being a member. So, what we're going to study is a policy. How is a policy adopted by a third state? So, can Western Balkans adopt security defense policy? Moving on, we have seen that since 2009, European Union have institutionalized differentiation by allowing some member states whose military capabilities fulfill higher criteria and which have made more binding commitments to do so. 2016, described by many analysts as anhoribilis, we have migration crisis and Brexit, led to 2017, maybe not. Some answer for a lot of people, the answer is yes. The beginning of PESCO, Permanent Structural Cooperation. Since November 2017, we have 47 programs in 30 years from member states that want to cooperate in order to increase their military capabilities. What does that create differentiation? As you can see in the next slide, we have some states like Germany, France, and Italy who are the pioneers, who are the champions of that, who participate from the 47 programs, Spain in 23, France in 20, Italy in 17. And we have some other states like Slovenia in 3, or Malta or Ireland in 2. So we have some states that adopt and want to promote the European security and defense policy and give resources to that, and some states that they do not so. So, also we have to keep in mind that we have two types of PESCO programs. The ones that include defense industry, which means that some PESCO programs want to create new military equipment that is capable to adapt to new challenges. And the fourth, industrial revolution, I mean, adapting to the warfare environment and artificial intelligence mostly, and new ISR, new surveillance methods. And also we have the programs that increase military capabilities of member states in the EU as a consequence by exchange of facilities and know-how, of military know-how. But what can that be? How can that be correlated to Western Balkans? Until now, it is written in PESCO text, the institutional text, that third states can participate in PESCO. The criteria, because the debate is ongoing, we have states that they want high criteria and states who have less criteria, so PESCO can be more open. What is the added value? The third state must convince of its added value. And now the question the second question that can be related to the first one. Can Western Balkans deliver added value to the EU by their participation in PESCO? How can it work? From my analysis until now, the European Union can have open access and movement in the region. By PESCO programs, if a member state can, if a third state will participate in PESCO, let's say Serbia, can give its facilities to what is supposed to be European Union battle groups in order to move and use its ground. That will be a new architecture of a new security architecture in the region. Also, the European Union can transfer its norms to Western Balkans by delivering techniques, methods of military capabilities to Western Balkan states. They can absorb the part of the state which is working with defense and security to its norms. From my experience, that will be a huge impact in the influence the European Union can have on the states, because the Western Balkan states, their democracies suffer from lack of security. It has been foretold in previous presentations. EU can exclude other actors by creating a high level of interdependence in security and defense. That is true for Russia, China. That cannot be true for the United States, as Mr. Yannis Bastian said that the United States reaffirmed their interest. But I believe that it can be surely true for China and Russia. It should be noted that Serbia in 2017 has reaffirmed an agreement with Russia for exchange of military cooperation. But how can this work for EU? The EU can work it out with Serbia if it can be a new way of, not a new way, if it will hold on its autonomy. If EU will show its separation from the NATO, let's say there are some proposals from France, coming from France, that the European member states that also are part of NATO to speak in one voice. If that can be seen in future through PESCO, that will give a level of autonomy that can attract Serbia, because Serbia, in my point of view, is standing somewhere in between in its neutrality. Doesn't want to cooperate a lot with the West, doesn't want to cooperate a lot with Russia, and it started cooperating with China. It can be discussed later. How it can work for Western Balkans? Serbia, among all Western Balkan states, has a certain amount of defense industrial capabilities. Not so big one, but it's in good level, preserved from their Yugoslavian as a Yugoslavian heritage. That can be modernized by working in some consortiums with European defense industries through PESCO programs. That is something that I think Serbia needs to, because Serbia needs a pathway in order to escape its neutrality. I can elaborate on that later. States, Western Balkan states can strengthen their resilience by adopting EU capabilities that address new security challenges. That goes on a lot to hybrid threats, hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare is a new type of warfare where the will of the state is manipulated by hurting its intelligence or its economy through other ways. But the trend is that the military shall hold on high strategic level the ways in order to address these challenges. The regional cooperation is promoted. There can be some schemes, some frameworks, some programs that can bring all Western Balkan states under the leadership of European member states, let's say Austria, let's say Italy, where who are actors who can do that under framework and build up through a PESCO program the regional cooperation which is so much needed. And finally, the Western Balkan states can be security providers because this is a stereotype. Security, European Union and NATO provide security to the Western Balkans, but the Western Balkans do nothing about their security. It can be overcome. It can be overcome, this stereotype. But among that can be seen as a benefit for the Western Balkans, we should also note that there is some chance that specific European states can promote their security policy, which may differ from the European one in the region through tailor-made PESCO programs. Let's say like Hungary, which has its own strategy as mentioned before, or Austria, who has a different until now migration policy, as we have seen that from 2016 from other member states. And from my perspective, the most, let's say, where the devil hides is that the institutional framework that will offer Western Balkan states inclusion in PESCO at the same time can have opposite outcome in other regions. There are two critical regions for the European Union, the Eastern Mediterranean, where Turkey is involved, and Ukraine, where Russia is involved. So I try to be as quick as possible in order to be on time. So
and you did a sterling job, and it's much appreciated.
So yes.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. And that leaves us with about 14 minutes to have questions and comments. And I'm going to follow Florian, what Florian did in the previous session, which is I'm going to make just a couple of comments about each of the papers, which I found absolutely fascinating, I have to say. And then with the aim really of just having responses from each of you. And I don't know what technology allows or doesn't allow, but that seems to be the order of the day. So I'll just speak very quickly, make some comments about each of the papers. Firstly, Jens, I mean, I found this absolutely fascinating. My two comments, really, or questions, are this. Firstly, what about Russia? And you know, famously, it's often said about Russia. Russia has an inability to see China. It kind of, you know, has this kind of myopic view of China that doesn't sort of change. And I wonder whether this is embedded in some of that. And secondly, it seemed at times that you present China very much as a sort of as a passive actor here. On one hand, you know, China's got its interest in the region, and there's investment, and there's infrastructure and all that, and yet it's being rebuffed by this kind of, you know, rekindled interest of the US and the whole thing around 5G. And I wondered really what your sort of take on it. You know, what is it that interests China? Is it markets? Is it more of a kind of geopolitics? So they're just sort of questions that are off the top of my head, and it'd be good to hear some responses. Florian, a really interesting paper, and with another completely different research hat on, I'm involved in this project looking at kind of pro-EU activism in the UK, and we're part of this study that really is looking at something very different. I mean, what we're seeing amongst Eurosceptics is their attempt to redefine Europe, redefine a European identity, which is, you know, in many quarters is greeted as being entirely pernicious, particularly when, you know, that is, you know, when there's a sort of it coincides with gaining control over the European Parliament, or gaining more seats in the European Parliament, or whatever. But my question is this: you know, in particular in the context of Western Balkans, should we perhaps see this as positive? You know, in other words, does it suggest a kind of politicization of Europe and the whole concept of Europe that has been so missing in the whole enlargement process of this country? So in other words, you know, passive consensus to a kind of constraining dissensus, but in the context of the Western Balkans, we've never really had, it's not even been about passive consensus. There's been, you know, a complete, you know, understanding of Europe as being completely depoliticized. So I'd just like to sort of tease a little bit more about that, and whether it will lead to a re-engagement with Europe that may ultimately be positive. The two final papers. I mean, Péter, I'm not an economist, and this is, it's really nice to see world systems theory, which I just taught to students over many years because I used to really enjoy teaching it. But my question is one about, if you were giving this talk on this paper, we were discussing this in 1990. What's different? And at moments, and it's not a criticism. It's not a negative comment at all. It's my question to know, actually, is there just a stifling continuity that these countries, the Visegrad countries, or however we might, brand them, their relationship to the core is largely unchanged. And what does that tell us about 3 decades of political economy and marketization? And then finally, Yannis, I mean, this really got me thinking, and I love the as it were, there's almost a level of, as we might say, chutzpah about it. There's a sort of cheekiness here, which I absolutely love. That this is very much about thinking out loud. But my question really is, where's the politics? I mean, given Serbia's response to NATO sanctions against Russia and all this, is the EU really going to start welcoming or viewing Serbia so differently as a security partner, as opposed to a security risk or a threat? And I really think that's really it's this question about where are the politics. So I will absolutely quickly shut up there and open the floor. Why don't we go in reverse order? If you would like to respond, that would be great. So Yannis, do you want to sort of take the floor?
Of course. So in my mind, we have two worlds coming together. Maybe. But there's always a need of stimulus in order to come closer. I was in Serbia 2 or 3 years ago. They were celebrating First World War, and the notion is that Serbia was a part of Entente. You know what I mean? So there is some historical background, and there is a political will in order to place Serbia as part of the winning world, as a part of the Western world, as part of in the alliance of good, maybe. Excuse me if I use the wrong word. And so we have the other world, the EU, which is craving for autonomy. It's craving for autonomy, especially after Brexit. Because the reasons, there are a lot. United States new strategy, China is coming and wants to be to replace United States in world dominance. Maybe the change of the structure of the world, whatever. So this world, a big one, the European Union, and the small one, the Serbian political thought, they are transforming themselves. So the stimulus, in my opinion, who can deliver the stimulus? The mechanism I described is there, but there are some countries that through European Union can deliver that stimulus. I believe Greece is one of them. Greece also needs strategic depth. It doesn't have.
Very good, thanks. Péter, do you want to come in? My rather sort of too vague question, I suppose, but you may want to just pick up on other things or ask each other questions. I don't know.
So I just didn't hear you. You were calling for me.
Yes, indeed. Sorry, I was.
Okay.
But by all means, feel free not to even respond to my rather sort of general thinking out loud question, but and by all means ask other questions of the other panelists. But it's up to you entirely.
Well, my short answer is that there's no single answer for the question. So why after 30 years still this is the situation? So there are different narratives, at least in Hungary. That's what I know better. And here I would say one general answer is that the misuse of resources after the enlargement joining to the EU is one of the group of narratives. But the other one, which contributes to this accumulation state theory, is that the opening of the markets of Hungary and the being forerunner in privatization and FDI inflow, it helped or it contributed rather to the accumulation of capital outside of Hungary, or the leave of capital from Hungary, and that's what Gábor Schering uses as one of the core argument, that because of this, the so-called national capitals of Hungary had this kind of revolution. So they revolted against this kind of economic policy, and kind of forced, may not be a good word here, forced, but initiated this kind of turn in economic policy of the government, which started to favor national capitals. So these are two different narratives here, and there's no single answer. But as a continuation to this, after this turn of financial nationalism in Hungary, the relations between Hungary and Serbia, or the rest of the Western Balkans as well, is kind of duplicated or mirrored the previous center semi-peripheral relations between the center of EU or core EU and Hungary, for example.
Thank you, Florian.
Thanks, Adam. This is something I've been wondering about. To which degree, of course, you could say, well, any polity, of course, desires to be, or it gets consolidated by the acceptance of diverse actors of different political ideology and conviction to act with it. And I think I've often felt that in the past there's often been another distinction between criticizing policies of the European Union and the European Union as an organization, and that's often been blurred in the past. So maybe it is what is happening is in fact the acceptance of the European Union as the framework, and just the policies diverge. So that's the positive interpretation of it, and I do share some of that optimism or maybe take on that. But then, of course, there is the worrying side that it's also then a question of what does it mean for enlargement. And again, if you have what I was quoting, Orban's argument for enlargement is one which is fundamentally, I think, in conflict with EU integration in the way we've conventionally understood, namely one which is driven by certain values of the EU Lisbon Treaty, and also conditionality. So basically, is that the kind of enlargement we want? And I would say no. It will fail also because this is not a hegemonic concept. It's contested, and certainly some member states would not accept that as an approach. And so I would argue that first of all it would fail, and second of all it probably would lead to the notion that authoritarianism and undermining the rule of law is compatible with EU membership, and then the question is, what is the point of the European Union? So in that sense, I would say at least that understanding is probably not very constructive and helpful for making the European Union work better. And also then the question is, you can go back historically, you can say there are many visions of Europe. I mean, there's a fascist vision of Europe as well. I mean, so is it just good because it envisages Europe? It's in a certain way value neutral. There's a colonial vision of Europe. And I think it's maybe just more that we have to move away in our understanding of visions of Europe as being normatively good, and rather say, well, what are the substantive values underpinning it? And maybe it's that focus which is more important than seeing it as inherently good, because I do worry about these negative connotations, also how they work as a strategy to disguise, of course, more conventional nationalism, which is seen as odious. So I don't think Pegida in East Germany was very European. It tried to have outreach antennas elsewhere, but it didn't kind of work. It was a very specific East German phenomena, but one also which they couldn't call themselves nationalist Germans, so they called themselves patriotic Europeans. But in fact, the first name would have been more appropriate.
No, I just jump in quick. I completely agree. It wasn't particularly. I wasn't saying it in a sort of rather glib way that, oh, let's just see where this, let's ring. I mean, I think it's more about, the arrogance of, or this, the unwillingness of Europe to really defend its so-called left liberal values, of which was laid bare, of course, in 2016, where, there was nobody. No European mainstream leader apart from Merkel, and Merkel came, obviously paid a price for that, and who was prepared to defend these so-called values. So in a sense, Europe is getting what it deserves, and actually, if it ultimately leads to a more honest conversation about actually, well, what does Europe? I mean, we may all find that abhorrent, but at least there's an element of which that it's holding a mirror up to actually the way Europe, and that's for me is what the politicization may involve. But this is obviously a bigger conversation which hopefully we can pursue beyond here.
Absolutely.
Jens, the floor is yours. Sorry, you have I took a bit more of your time. Go ahead.
Adam, just on your last point, I do not think that it is only Merkel that defended these values in 2016. I mean, do not forget the situation of Greece and the manner in which the government back then also defended European values in the refugee issue, including in 2016. Do not forget the government in Italy also for that, or in Spain. I find it slightly retroactive quarterbacking if we only focus on Merkel. I think she does not deserve that amount of praise by ignoring other in Europe who tried to do the same. To the questions that you asked me. First, what about Russia? I focused on China. Adding Russia to the big power game, I can make a number of statements. One with regard to Chinese-Russian cooperation. That already exists. China and Russia, for example, have joint naval exercises every year in the Mediterranean. In Serbia, China is building the so-called Budapest-Belgrade high-speed railway line. But at the same time in Serbia, Russia is modernizing other parts of the railway network in the country. And in Hungary, as I highlighted in my presentation, the United States is active in the nuclear energy sector of Romania, and Russia is active in the Hungarian nuclear energy sector by modernizing 2 nuclear power plants in Hungary at a cost of enormous consequence for the Hungarian budget. So you can see that there are different actors great power actors who are actually active, sometimes complementary to each other in the same country, let alone in the same sector. But it is also important to highlight what Russia cannot do in comparison to China. Russia is not in a position to offer, as other countries have signed up, to the so-called 17+1 network. There, China has established an institutional architecture that has nothing comparable on offer from the Russian side. Equally, with regard to the Belt and Road Initiative and how it is becoming visible in the Western Balkans, it is China that offers their conceptual vision. Russia does not have anything comparable to offer that could match the Belt and Road Initiative. And Russia does not have the financial means, the deep pockets that China can bring to the table in terms of the variety of infrastructure projects that Chinese policy banks are currently financing, and where the countries in question are increasing their debt exposure vis-à-vis China. On the issue of what interests China, Adam, yes, market interests play a major role. One of them is the export orientation with regard to the trains and cargo ships that arrive from China via Eurasia in the Western Balkans onward to Hungary and to Western Europe. There is a dimension of exporting their overcapacity from China to other parts of Europe. But there's also, when you talk to Chinese representatives in China, you frequently hear that, yes, we do not have a political agenda, but we do want to show the political advantages of our system in China. We want to discuss these advantages with stakeholders in the Western Balkans. And one shouldn't underestimate that element of what I would call soft power dimension in play. There's also reputational capital at stake for China, namely that so far the European Union has refused to label China as a market economy in the WTO. And what China is doing in the Western Balkans, in Southeastern Europe, reaching out to other countries in the 17+1 network that are EU member states, is trying to establish reputational capital. For example, in order to drive forward this recognition of a market economy. Equally, China is starting to do something which 2-3 years ago would have been unthought of. It is actually tapping into available EU structural funds of individual countries. The Croatian bridge project that I highlighted in one of my slides is 85% financed by EU structural funds. And the tender was won by a Chinese consortium. So you can see that they are also diversifying their financial basis in terms of access to EU funding instruments. Last point, and it links also to the presentation of Yannis. China is entering for the first time, and here Serbia plays a leading role, for the first time the European arms market. In the summer of this year, during the pandemic, Serbia bought military drones from China. It's the first country that has done so in the region. And in my view, that's a game changer, because there are also other military instruments on offer which China is happy, most willing to provide to individual countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And Serbia there has served as a door opener for the first time.
Thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating. And you know, exactly the sort of the politics, if you like, or the sort of perspectives that I really wanted you to draw you out on. So this is really fascinating. And thanks very much for that very full response. So it's been a super workshop and discussion, and I think this is at the end of the workshop. It only remains for me to obviously thank all of you on the panel, and to sort of announce that the workshop dinner this evening can be found probably in your freezers. You need to make sure that you cook it thoroughly, and you know, if it does contain any meat, make sure it's really cooked thoroughly. You don't want to get food poisoning. Let's all wait for that wonderful time where we can meet in person and hug each other and be all close and all that sort of stuff. But in the meantime, this is a great format, and thank you very much indeed. Lovely to see you all, and I'll leave it there. Thanks, folks.